Hello, welcome.
Hello.
So today is the last day of recorded talks for this symposium. And on this day, I really was hoping to find some speakers to be able to bring attention to the correlation of what happens when we heal our own inner relationship to gender and sexuality. What happens then? What are the implications or what are the connections to healing of our world in all other ways, including environmental healing, racial healing, just healing around violence and war and all of these humongous topics. Any injustice you can possibly think of, I feel like is deeply, deeply connected and rooted in an underlying need to heal our relationships to gender and sexuality. So the purpose of the talks on this day, including the one we're about to have with Nick, are going to be focused on that. And I'm so happy that Nick could be here and could be talking today. So specifically, this is Nick Mather, give your full name, and his topic is Witches, Science, and the Inquisition of Nature, which I am so excited about. And before we start, I just want to read your bio. So Nick is the host of the Rebel Spirit Radio podcast, which is where I found you because you were interviewing another one of the speakers on the symposium, and I loved your interview. And he teaches philosophy and religious studies at a number of California community college. He has an MA in religious studies from the University of Denver and a Ph.D. in philosophy and religion from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. His academic research focuses on eco-spirituality, environmental ethics, and comparative religion and mysticism. As host of Rebel Spirit Radio, he engages in conversation with writers, artists, educators, and spiritual leaders to explore topics in spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship to a living earth. So awesome. So perfect for this symposium. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm so looking forward to this.
Awesome. So take it away.
All right.
Start.
So, so witches, what was it? Witches, Science, and the Inquisition of Nature.
Yes, awesome title.
Yeah.
So many layers to it.
Yeah. And I'm going to do my best to, there's a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to do my best to be concise and be kind of orderly, although we're going to talk about order. So my starting point is my concern with this looming specter of climate change. And one of the things that I like to start with whenever I start with these conversations is I go back to something that Noam Chomsky wrote in 2011. And he was writing in response to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that took place that year in Durban, South Africa. And he wrote that intelligent extraterrestrials observing the failure of the world governments, and in particular the United States, to seriously address what is arguably the single most important issue facing humankind, climate change, that these aliens would not be remiss if they inferred that humanity was infected by some kind of lethal insanity.
Yes.
And I think that Chomsky was dead on right. And I believe that this insanity has only gotten much, much worse. You know, we are on an ecocidal path.
Yeah.
And
I love that word. Wow.
Yeah.
It's an awesome word.
Yeah. And there are so many things that are interconnected with this, especially social justice issues. And the irony, of course, is that Western culture, and in particular its philosophical and scientific traditions, have presented itself as the very epitome of rationality. Yet something has obviously gone very, very wrong. While there have been many attempts to find a root cause to the ecological crises, and that is the plural because there are many crises and they are all interconnected. So it's quite frankly impossible to isolate a single cause or idea or assumption that is responsible, because the problem is systematic. It's legion. And this is why some people have taken to referring to it, and I love this phrase, they refer to it as a wicked problem. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So it's my contention that the state of the planet reveals a sickness. It reveals a sickness inside of humanity.
Yeah.
As within, so without.
Yeah.
And in order to heal the earth, we need to heal ourselves. But we also need to understand how we got to where we are and find some possible paths to healing. I believe we have to understand history in order to challenge the future. I always steal this line from a Suzanne Vega song that we keep challenging the future with a profound lack of history. Wow. And so that's why I think we need to understand the history in order to change our trajectory. And so this is what I'm going to try to do in this presentation. My focus is going to be on the transformation of the Western world's understanding of nature, specifically during the 14th through the 16th centuries. And this is what set the stage for the Industrial Revolution and led us down this path of ecocide and self-destruction. And in order to do this, I'm going to be drawing from several different sort of disciplines. Particularly, I'm going to draw on environmental history, specifically from the work of Carolyn Merchant and her book, The Death of Nature. I'm also going to look at European paganism for the witches. And there I'm relying a lot on the work of Ronald Hutton. And also, and this is probably the main theme, is eco-feminist philosophy. And especially Val Plumwood and her book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature. I'll also be drawing upon myth, cosmology, and a little bit of ecospirituality as well. So that's the agenda now to set the stage, set the stage here. My first assumption is that descriptions of nature reveal cultural values. So we need to explore what the traditional views of nature were to understand how they changed. And in order to do that, I want to begin with a little bit of cosmology. And this is where the myth kind of comes in. Most myths in the ancient world presented the creation of the universe as the implementation of order onto chaos. And the chaos was more often than not represented by water. And so these ancient cosmologies there was a flat earth that was completely surrounded by water. That was chaos. And creation, again, was that implementation of order onto the chaos. And so you had this flat earth, and to protect it from the waters, there was a dome or a series of domes, what would be referred to as the firmament, right? So we see this in a variety of myths. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, for example, tells the story of creation through Marduk, the god Marduk, and this epic battle with the sea serpent monster Tiamat. And some people think that Tiamat is an old demonized goddess. And what Marduk does is he kills Tiamat and then he slices her in half, not horizontally, but vertically. And half of the body forms the basis of the earth, and then the other half he sets up as that firmament to protect the earth from the waters, right? We see this in Egypt with the goddess Nut. Her body is that firmament, and the sun travels through her at night. We see it in Greece, the Titan Atlas. I think we're all kind of familiar with Atlas, and people, I think, wrongly think that he's holding up the earth, but he's not. If you look close on the sculptures and depictions of Atlas, what you'll see on what he's holding up are more often than not, the zodiac, right? So he's holding up the night sky.
Wow.
And this is also what we see in the Bible. This is what is described in Genesis 1, right? You have a flat earth with a firmament, and it's surrounded by the cosmic waters. The very first thing it tells us in Genesis 1 is the Spirit of God is moving among the waters. This is before he created the earth. Well, what waters? It's the waters of chaos, right? And in this cosmology, so you have this flat earth, and the earth, though, was at the center of everything. And all the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, they all moved around the earth. So that's the basic picture. The other element here is that cosmologies usually serve to structure society. A cosmology always tells us what the human place is in the world. And the cosmology that we get is that, in addition to all of this, in conjunction with all of this, is that the universe is alive. And it was depicted in a variety of ways. And I think, one of my favorite examples comes from India, in one of their creation myths, which is the myth of Purusha, the cosmic being, right? And the cosmic being creates humanity through his body parts, right? So you have the head, that's where the Brahman Priests come in. And then the arms are the class of the Kshatriya, the warriors, that represents the strength. And then you have the thighs, which are the Shudra, that's the support, right? And then you have the feet. And I may have misspoken on one of these, but anyway, it's the general picture there, right? And what it does is it creates a social hierarchy. And the Brahman priests, for example, their main function was to perform rituals. And the reason they performed ritual was to maintain the cosmic order. And the idea was that there was this interdependence among the parts of the body. So it wasn't that the focus wasn't like we think in terms of the individual. The individual was always secondary to the collective, right? The individual was subordinate to the community. And we also see this in Greek philosophy with Plato. I don't know if he uses the body parts. In a way, he kind of does, but at the head, you have the rulers, the philosopher kings, and their virtue is wisdom, their rationality. And then you have the guardians, which are strength, which feeds into the ideas of the strength of the arms. And their virtues are courage. And then everyone else below, Plato only has 3 sort of classes, where the Indians had 4. For him, the rest of it is the stomach and what comes below, because it's all the appetites, right? And the virtue there is for moderation. But it's all of these classes working together, separate, but working as a whole, right? And this is the largest picture, that society, again, was seen as an organism. And that's the primary metaphor that binds together self, society, and the cosmos, right? This implementation of order. The word that's used to describe this sort of worldview is organicism. And this is the philosophy that looks at the universe and all its parts as organic wholes and as living organisms. Like I said, the cosmos is an organic entity. Plato talks about this in the Timaeus. The universe is alive. It's a being of sorts. And it grows and develops from within this integrated unity of structure and function. And all parts of the cosmos were connected and interrelated in this living unity. And the last bit of this is that there's a vital life force, the anima mundi, that permeates the universe. So we get this idea that it's an animistic sort of system. You know, the universe is alive. Nature is alive. You know, it has an inherent spark to it, right? You know, the seed that's planted has a spark to it that causes it to grow, right? And the last part of this, sort of setting the stage here, in terms of nature, like I said, nature has this inherent creative power, but it is also identified with the female. And I think this is something that is very, very old. I think it goes back at least to the Paleolithic. This is at least back to 40,000 BCE, maybe even further back in our evolutionary journey. You know, this idea of connecting nature to a goddess and to the feminine may actually have originated before Homo sapiens sapiens emerged on the scene. You know, it may be that deep. You know, I don't know. There's a little bit of compelling evidence for that, but you know, it's debated. It's debated, but it wouldn't surprise me one bit. But what happens with this is that you get essentially two images of nature based on the feminine. One is you get this, the nurturing mother, right? That nature is benevolent. Nature is peaceful. And this is images of the pastoral settings, right? But then this also, if the earth is the mother, it serves to constrain actions. In particular with things like mining. Because, you know, we develop metallurgy at a particular point in our journey. And I think it's Carolyn Merchant who notes that, you know, one of the constraints are that you don't just start digging into the entrails of your mother without asking for permission.
Wow.
Right. And so there's that aspect, the nurturing mother. And that also, that image is very, very old. I know for a fact that goes back to the Paleolithic. But then you also have this other aspect, which is nature is wild. Nature is uncontrollable. Nature is threatening. You know, we have storms, we have droughts. It's chaos, it's disorder, right? This is the dark goddess. Yeah. In many ways. And so what becomes the major theme, I think, as humanity moves forward is domination and control of nature, domination and control of wild nature, of feminine nature. And that is going to be joined with the domination and control of women. Yeah. Okay. So this is where ecofeminism comes in. And ecofeminism, I think, is most closely based with radical feminism. And of course, by radical feminism, I don't mean extremism, but radical feminists, you know, what they want to do is they want to get to the root of the problem, because that's where what radical means.
I would call myself one. Yes.
Yeah. Me as well, you know, and what they identify as the root of the problem is patriarchy, right?
Not men. I want to be clear. The problem is not men. The
Right.
problem is the patriarchy. Yes, correct.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Men suffer from patriarchy as well.
Every gender.
Yeah.
Gender. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Huge. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, you know, because of the association of women with nature, the central concept of ecofeminism is that nature is a feminist issue. And it identifies the potential for women to bring about an ecological revolution. But, you know, the more I think about it, I love ecofeminism, but I also want to find a term that's a little bit more inclusive, because I don't think it's just women, but it's any group that is marginalized. Right? Yeah. And so what ecofeminism does is, you know, looking at this patriarchy, it attempts to uncover what is behind these natural systems of domination, exploitation, subjugation of both women and the natural world. And like I said, you know, this should also be extended because patriarchy does the same thing to people of color, to children, to the poor, to indigenous peoples, and I would also argue to the LGBTQ plus community.
Absolutely.
Right.
All of the above.
Yeah, all of the above. So because of its focus on this methodic oppression of what the eco-feminist philosopher Karen Warren has referred to, and this is always a little bit of a mouthful: women, other, human, others, nature, interconnections.
Say that one more time.
Yeah. Women, other, human, others, nature, interconnections.
Are there any commas in there?
Dashes.
Dashes.
Yeah.
Can you say it one more time with the dashes?
Yeah. So the way I've got it written, hopefully this was correct. It's woman dash other.
Okay.
Human, others dash nature, interconnections.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a complex set of, got it. Okay.
It is. It is. Right. But because it is looking at oppression and this sort of group of, you know, women and others and human other, right? The other is a central theme here. Eco-feminist philosophy holds social justice as one of its primary concerns.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the questions, of course, is going to be what allows for these social injustices and hierarchical dominations to occur. And the answer that is most common in ecofeminist philosophy is dualistic thinking.
Yeah.
You know, like the dichotomy of nature, culture, you know, human, other, right? Human, non-human, things like that.
Me and you, we are separate.
Yeah, totally separate.
Therefore, I can project everything negative onto you and away from me.
Yes, yes. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit here. I'm going to get there.
Yes.
But this dichotomy, there's a logic to it. There's a logic that justifies oppression. And I'm going to dig into that logic a little bit later. So to summarize where I've been so far is ecofeminist philosophy is the attempt to make explicit the patriarchal structures that provide for the systematic oppression of women, people of color, the subaltern, and nature via philosophies based in dualistic thinking. As a philosophy, ecofeminism reveals these structures in all of the basic categories or branches associated with Western philosophy. So logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. And it acts as a kind of corrective to the patriarchal biases that underlie Western philosophy. And it opens the door to the creation of a new philosophical underpinning of civilization. And I would add one more thing to my definition of eco-feminist philosophy, and one more characteristic, and that is that there is a religious and spiritual side to it. Okay. So with all of that said, I know that some people are thinking, well, wait a minute. He said that, this is all about witches. Where are the witches? And so I want to turn to the witches now. Okay. And one of the things I have to do is ask the question of, well, what do we mean by a witch? Okay. It's not as easy to answer as we might think. And I want to be clear as well that my discussion of witches is really going to be in reference to witches and witchcraft as it appeared in Europe, not so much in the colonies. Okay. But the witch is a symbol. The witch may even be an archetype that's found throughout the world. And on one basic level, the witch is seen as just something that is evil. A definition of a witch is that a witch causes harm to others through mystical or magical means. The witch is seen as a threat to the community. Okay. There is a sexual aspect to witches. We see this, I don't want to deviate too much, but one of the mythic figures that often gets associated with witches is the figure of Lilith.
I was just about to jump in and say, wait, this is making me think of Lilith. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Well, and there's biblical roots to a lot of this. And Lilith is an old Sumerian goddess of sorts, right? But she also there's a reference to Lilith, not as a goddess, but as a Lilith, which is this being that exists in night. Right? Often associated, I think, with the screech owl. And owls are very uncanny, because they can turn their heads all the way around and they're night creatures, right? So they're very uncanny. But in the Western Abrahamic tradition, this actually comes out of the Talmud. So if you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in the Bible, it is two completely different creation stories. It uses a different name for God. Genesis 1 uses Elohim. Genesis 2 uses Yahweh. Wow. There's a different order of creation in both. Genesis 2 is where we get the story of Adam and Eve. And in that, Eve is the last bit of creation, right? And where she is born completely unnaturally of the man, right? Genesis 1, there's this really interesting passage where when God creates humans at the same time, man and woman at the same time. And God's also speaking in the plural. Let us make humankind in our image, right?
Wow.
So scholars, have been digging into this, and that's a whole other presentation on what is going on there. The short answer is that it has its roots in the polytheism of Canaan, right? Because the Israelite tradition emerged out of that. But Jews very early on, they didn't really take a literalist approach to the text. They inquired to the text, they investigated the text, and they would ask questions of the text. And so one of the questions was, well, how are we supposed to make sense of this, of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? And the fact that it seems like Adam, and Adam, by the way, is not a proper name. It's just a title, the Adam. But that it seems like you have these two different creation accounts. And one of the solutions was presented in the Talmud that, here's the answer. Adam had a wife before Eve. And that wife before Eve was Lilith.
Right.
And what happened was Lilith, she refused to submit to Adam.
Right.
She wanted to be treated as equal. And she also, sexually, she wanted to be on top.
Or at least equal.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's actually, you find the passages there.
It says like on top?
Yeah. And what happens, she gets banished. And where does she get banished? She gets banished to the wilderness, to the
Mm.
wild, chaotic, dark nature.
Wow.
And, you know, she has been presented in stories and even, you know, artwork as quite often this sort of young nude woman with, you know, very sumptuous sort of body, large breasts and wild hair. She's wild and immodest. And that is posited, you know, here's our dichotomies, our dualisms, as against a very well-behaved wife or daughter. Right. And so she gets associated with witchcraft because she's a creature of night. Right. And there's this idea of sexuality, dangerous sexuality there. From a certain perspective.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. You know, so there's that sexual aspect to witches. There's also this idea of magic. People have been practicing magic for a very long time. You know, it was there in Mesopotamia. Most of the history of magic really goes back to Egypt. And again, another dualism, we end up talking about white magic versus black magic. But that's a later development. But going back to Egypt, what really came out of that is ceremonial magic. And sometimes also natural magic, and that's the manipulation of nature for personal benefit. And it was often not the women who were performing or practicing ceremonial magic, but the literate and the elite. But they were also considered heretics. And some of them did suffer through the Inquisition, but not as much as women would. So there's that sort of magical aspect to it. There's also, I think, the understanding is that there is remnants of an ancient goddess-based pagan tradition. And Ronald Hutton, he's a UK scholar that has devoted his entire academic career to sort of uncovering or examining this idea of a European paganism. He sort of rejects it. He rejects the idea. But I think I kind of disagree with him. I don't think that Christianity was so successful to completely eradicate what came before it. And I always want to ask him, it's like, well, if there wasn't this pagan tradition, what was there before Christianity? So I think that the European witches did have some lineage of ancient non-Christian earth-based practices. The other aspect that I would throw in here is that there was a European shamanism. You know, and shamanism, that's also a very loaded term. The definition I'm going to use is that shamanism is about entering non-ordinary states of consciousness and working with spirits. And the primary function of the shaman is healing. Okay. And we can see this in the reports of European witches, especially their use of what's been called the witch's ointment, which seems to have been some kind of entheogen that allowed them to have these sort of spiritual flights, right? So I think that the witch, it combines all these things, right? It's very complicated. They exist still in an animistic world because they're dealing with spirits, right? Now, the other thing that happens though is, and this is definitely a part of Christian tradition, is they get associated with the satanic, and the satanic is the other, right? But also notice that, you know, there's this ongoing tradition of, especially in Christianity, of accusing groups within society who embrace a religion other than Christianity, religions that don't conform or to the norm. They are always accused of being satanic. They're always accused of engaging in antisocial activities. And this is exactly what the witches were accused of engaging in orgies, ritual murder, especially of children, and cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
And it fascinates me that we still hear this in conspiracy theories today, that people are,
Yes, we do.
murdering and eating babies, right?
Oh, wow. How did I not make that connection until right this second?
Yeah, it's old. It's
Ding,
been
ding,
around.
ding.
It's been around. And there's also this anti-Semitism, because this was also, Jews were accused of this. It was called the blood libel, right?
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. This is why I say there's a history to everything.
Of course there is.
I also think it's important to note that you get, and this would be another entirely different presentation, but the Greek god of nature, the wild god of nature, was Pan. And Pan, the imagery of Pan gets associated with the devil.
The devil, yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think there's any mistake there that Pan is the god of nature. And that when witches were accused of being satanic, I think there is that connection there, with the natural world. Now, I think that the witch, the way I understand it, I always like to think of Simone de Beauvoir, the French existentialist philosopher.
Yep. And her in college in French.
Yep. Yeah. She called woman the deviant other, right? That women were described in relation to men, where men were what was normal. That's why, she said women were the deviant and they were the other. And it's this idea of otherness, again, not just women, but all these other groups that need to be included. And I think the witch is the deviant other.
Yeah.
And that's why people would accuse the witch of being evil and doing all sorts of things, because the witch was also a symbol of the violence of nature. Witches could raise storms to ruin crops, witches caused illness. They stole milk. They obstructed generation. They could keep a baby from being born or cause a baby to be born stillborn. And it wasn't just women that were accused of being witches, but predominantly it was women who were accused of being witches. And so these, the witch is a disorderly woman, and like chaotic nature, needed to be controlled, right? And from a female perspective, though, the witch can also be a symbol of independent female authority. Witchcraft could represent a form of power by which oppressed lower class women, and it was usually lower class women who were accused of being witches, could retaliate against social injustices and resist male domination. They, instead of harm, they could also be in practice of healing through the use of spirits and the regenerative nature of powers of nature, and herbs, and healing that way. And the one last thing I wanted to add is there is a counterpart to this European witch, and that is the midwife. Many midwives in this period of time were accused of witchcraft.
Right.
And what's interesting is the midwife also becomes this symbolic center of struggle over control of matter and nature, because what was going on is, the midwife symbolized female control over the female reproductive function. But at this time, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, male doctors, they had developed a technology of forceps.
Oh, wow.
And they said, oh no, if you want to have if you're going to birth a baby, you need to use this technology. And by the way, we men, we're educated. We've studied anatomy. You midwives, you're uneducated. You don't know what you're doing.
And that absolutely continues today. Yes.
Yes. And I think this is one of the roots of men attempting to control women's reproduction. Right. So, the other aspect here with the witch is that most people lived in very small rural communities. And these are communities that were at the mercy of the forces of nature. And in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, it was also this period of a long climatic downturn. The weather was colder and wetter, which led to a decrease in crop yields. So what did people do? Instead of, they didn't have an understanding of climate. They're like, it's the witches. The witches are doing this. Right?
Can I throw in a
Yeah,
little tiny funny thing that's making
for
me
sure.
think of around the time when when Trump was contesting the election, there's this little video that kept popping up for me on Facebook of this 2-year-old boy. And he's in Wales or England. He had an adorable accent. That's all I know, but I couldn't quite distinguish it because he's 2. And anyway, he had drawn on a mirror, he had like taken a marker and drawn all over this mirror or whatever it was. And his mother was taking a video of him talking, like she was saying, how did that happen? How did this marker get all over the mirror? The little 2-year-old says, Batman did it. Batman. It was Batman. Batman did it. So it's like the witches did everything.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
I love that. Yeah. I thought you were going to say he was going to say that the witch did it, but
oh no, but it's the same. It's all the same thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Choose a scapegoat and just blame it on them, whatever it is.
Yeah. It's always scapegoating.
Yeah.
Which I will also get to a little bit, I think, here. So, during this sort of witchcraft craze in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, the numbers vary. I've seen numbers as high as 2 million. And people have called this like the women's Holocaust. But I think that is greatly exaggerated. Ronald Sutton, he puts the number somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 women were killed as witches. But even at that lower number, if you consider the population of Europe at the time, that's still pretty large. That's a large percentage. And the victims of the witch trials were primarily, like I said before, people in the lowest social order. And this was also the case more often than not in the colonies. But what often happened was accusations of witchcraft. And this is exactly what happened in Salem. And, I have to admit that my family was directly involved in the Salem witchcraft trials. So one of my ancestors actually wrote the very first history of the Salem witchcraft trials.
Well, and here you are.
Yeah.
Wow.
But he kind of whitewashed it, and it cost him dearly. But a lot of the accusations seem to have been based on nothing more than petty squabbles. And sometimes people attempting to advance politically. They had political ambitions. But at the same time, especially in Salem, young girls making accusations of witchcraft, what that did is it brought attention to themselves, attention that they would not normally receive.
And power.
Yeah, and the power. But like I said, my focus here is not the colonies, but the European witch trials. I think a lot of it still applies to what was going on in the colonies.
I'm curious, just like a 10-second version. How would you sum up the difference between the American colonies versus European version of witch, like the phenomena? How would you? What's the basic difference?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that the basic difference, the cultural settings, I think that in the colonies, it was much more of the petty squabbles in terms of the small communities.
So the petty squabbles were more of the driving impetus to make the witch accusation. Okay.
Yeah. I think that, the reason I'm kind of stumbling a little bit with that is because I think there's also this history of Protestantism. And the Inquisition was Catholic, although the Protestant Reformation, there was also anti-witch sentiments. But in places like France, which was predominantly Catholic, I think that the major difference would be just the differences between a Catholic worldview that had, the Inquisition was actually an office of the church. Whereas in Puritan America or Puritan colonies, they didn't have that, right?
So in Europe, you would say it was more of an institutionalized persecution of quote unquote witches.
And also this attempt to root out heretics.
Got it. So it was more intense in a certain way in Europe.
Okay. Because there really weren't that many in the colonies. Salem was, the most notorious one,
right?
But it was only a small period of time, and very quickly after the Salem witchcraft trials, people in the colonies were like, "Yeah, we screwed up."
Really? Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
How did they realize that? We could go off on this for like 5 hours. So but I'm just 10-second version. How did they? What was the realization? Why would they realize that they screwed up?
I think that they realized that the people that they had hanged were actually innocent.
Oops.
And the other thing was just, I guess, advance in reasoning. One of again, my ancestors, it was father and son. It was Increase Mather and Cotton Mather. Now my family comes from Increase's brother, so our lineage goes through that. So I'm not directly connected.
To
the lineage.
And probably I am too. Probably lots of us are.
But what Increase did, and Cotton Mather agreed with this, is allowed for what was referred to as spectral evidence. And what that was is, for example, I can say that I was, minding my own business and washing my dishes, and all of a sudden I felt someone come up behind me and slap me upside the head.
Oh dear.
And I'm going to say it was Martha. Martha did it.
Yeah.
You sent your spectral form to do it. And Increase Mather and Cotton Mather said, yeah, that's totally legit. And so they allowed that into the trials. And very, and there were people, right away, they were like, yeah, no, that doesn't make sense. But after there's always this sort of reckoning after a horrific act. And after, what was it, 20 people were hanged for witchcraft, I think the community was like, what have we done?
Wow.
So anyway, there's that. Moving on.
Just to say, but there's also a parallel with that to me. I think there's so many layers, right? It's like, so we have this sort of air of trauma, I would say, in this time around the idea of being persecuted as a witch. I think a lot of people identify with that archetype in themselves. I certainly say it's true for me. But then what you're naming is also a reverberation of the guilt that came along with the incorrect action, right? Which I think is probably, again, very parallel to the incorrect actions we're taking all the time, every single day, with regard to our planet, blah, 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 all of it, right? So it's not just the reverberations of trauma as being the victim, but also the reverberations of trauma of being the perpetrator. In some way. All of it.
And trauma is key. It's, trauma is not something that I'm necessarily addressing here, but I absolutely agree that I think all of us are traumatized in one way or the other.
Totally.
And that manifests, and I think that the manifestation of it is what I said at the beginning is, as within, so without.
Right.
We have this traumatized world,
right?
Because we are traumatized. It's
absolutely
this sort of vicious cycle, right? That we need to break. We need to break somehow. And hopefully I will offer at the end some ways of breaking it. Right?
Mm.
So the last thing I wanted to do is on the witches, before making the connection with science, is the trials. The women often had defenders, right? And what was interesting is in the defense, women would be portrayed as being incapable of clear thought.
Oh, wow.
They were heedless in their beliefs. They were impatient. They were depressed, melancholic is how they would say it. Women were unable to control their emotions. They couldn't but help themselves, right? And old women in particular were portrayed as being particularly stupid and mentally debilitated. Thus, they were deceived, very easily deceived by the devil, just like Eve had been tempted in the garden.
Oh no.
Right.
Yes.
So you can see that there is this, the symbol of the witch is, I think, emblematic of how women have been thought of. And there's that natural connection, right? Now, what's interesting is all of this is happening during a time of change, where there were challenges to traditional cosmology. And these are just basic things, just observations, challenged the paradigm of the earth being the center and everything going around the earth. Just watching, the main issue was retrograde motion of planets. If the planets are moving in these spheres, and eventually you do get this idea that there are these spheres around the earth, right? If they're moving in these perfectly circular spheres, and they had to be perfectly spherical because that's what Plato said, how do you account for that backwards motion? And so they came up with these things, like they were called epicycles. So it was like little perfect circles within the circles. So the planet would hit this little epicycle and do this little loop, right? And then go forward again. It was saving the appearances.
Yeah.
And it got really complex. So you would actually have epicycles within epicycles within epicycles.
Wow. Interesting.
And it was, the language that is used is that it was an anomaly, right? And when we talk about scientific paradigms always shift because there was an anomaly that the old paradigm can't answer.
Right.
And that was what retrograde motion was. It was the anomaly.
Wow.
Well, what fixed that is the moving the earth from the center to making the sun the center, right? So this is Copernicus, right? And he's in the 15th, late 15th century, early 16th century. He publishes on the heliocentric model of the solar system, I think in 1512. Got himself into trouble for it. Then we have Galileo, and Galileo, he develops the telescope, right? And he adopts Copernicus's heliocentric model, but he also notes, he's like looking through his telescope, he's like, oh yeah, and there are moons going around Jupiter, and if the earth is at the center, you can't have moons going around Jupiter, right? So you're starting to get, just based on observation, challenges to the old cosmology. And the two primary figures for the new science are Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes. Okay. So Bacon, he was born 1561. He died in 1626. He gave us the science of induction and the idea of empirical science, that science needed to be reproducible, right? And based on observation. He wanted to refound human knowledge based on this, right? He wanted to provide a systematic method for scientific inquiry. So he, the reproducible experimentation, it's moving from particular things to the universal. That's what induction often is seen as, right? His ideas were rooted in an emerging market economy where we start seeing a widening gap between the classes. Wealth started moving upwards. And what happened was he and Descartes reduced female nature to a resource for economic production.
Yep.
Now, Bacon, his primary mentor was James I of the King James Bible fame.
Wow.
And James I supported anti-feminist and anti-witchcraft legislation. You had at this time, it was called the controversy over women, because women were starting to challenge traditional roles of dress. You know, women, this is so horrifying. They were actually going to the barber and having their hair cut short. And they were being referred to as the man woman. You can't have that. You can't have that. So James I, what he did is he implemented the death penalty for all witches. Okay. Before that, it was only in instances where a witch was thought to have killed someone.
Wow.
Right? And he wanted to reinforce gender roles.
And,
now,
and what time frame was this again?
The early 17th century. So it would have been in the 1600s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very late 1600, or excuse me, late 16th century, early 15th century. Mm-hmm. Now, Bacon was also a lawyer. Okay, and so his writings, and this is the Novus Organum is one of his main texts, and the New Atlantis. He draws on the language of the interrogations of the witch trials and the mechanical devices used to torture witches to get confessions. So I want to share with you some quotes taken directly from Bacon to highlight this. So, nature exhibits herself more clearly under the trials and vexations of art. Okay, now art there means the technology, the mechanical devices, right? So nature exhibits herself more clearly under the trials and vexations of art than when left to herself. The new man of science must not think, and this is, I take this from Carolyn Merchant, so she's got some of his quotes in here. The new man of science must not think that the inquisition of nature is any part interdicted or forbidden. Nature must be bound into service and made a slave, put in constraint and molded by the mechanical arts. The searchers and spies of nature are to discover her plots and secrets. Okay, this is another direct quote. A few of these are direct quote. I am come in very truth, leading to you nature with all her children to bind her to your service and make her your slave. We have no right to expect nature to come to us. Nature must be taken by the forelock, being bald behind. You know, that's the image of the old cartoons of the caveman dragging the woman by the hair into the cave. That's the imagery that's being used to justify this new science. By art in the hand of man, nature can be forced out of her natural state and squeezed and molded. In that way, human knowledge, human knowledge and human power meet as one. Yeah, I'm sorry, we're
no, that was it. Just I'm noting that very directly using her as nature. We're being violent to her. Yes.
Yeah. Bacon referred to nature as a common harlot. He said nature was a common harlot and that it must be restrained and kept in order. There's that idea of order again, right?
And the sexual undertone.
Yes. This is, I think it's quite fair to say, this is the language of rape.
Literally. Yeah.
And so there's no mistake that we talk about the rape of the earth.
Right.
You know, which just highlights that connection between the female and nature, right?
Yes.
And so here, nature goes from being a loving, nourishing mother. It even goes from being a wild woman to being a slave, right? To being a slave,
raped and beaten and all of these things, right?
Yeah, right. And so this is what Carolyn Merchant notes in her book, The Death of Nature, is that the interrogation of witches served as a symbol for the interrogation of nature.
Wow.
Yeah. And the courtroom is a model for scientific inquisition, you know, and you have torture through mechanical devices as a tool for the subjugation of disorder. This is fundamental to the scientific method as power.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So,
Wow.
so there's Bacon, and that I hope I made that connection between witches and science.
Yes.
The other part that I want to include in here is the philosophy of Rene Descartes. And Descartes, of course, he is considered the father of modern philosophy. Descartes gives us, you know, one of the most famous sentences in all of philosophy, the cogito, you know, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
And what Descartes does is he gives us a dualism. Okay. Another, you know, dualism, right? Mind body. Where the mind, and for Descartes, it's going to be the masculine mind, masculine consciousness is privileged over everything else. The body, material stuff, is dead, lifeless. There is no animating force. There is no inherent internal spark anymore. He gets rid of that. Matter just takes up space. It can be measured, it can be weighed, it can be analyzed. And that's what analysis means, is to break something down into its smallest components. So you are no longer looking at the organic whole.
Right.
You're only looking at the part.
Right? And I'll just say, like, what a different feeling if it's, instead of cogito, you know, I mean, I think, therefore I am, versus I feel, therefore I am, or I breathe, therefore I am, or I don't know what, I dance, therefore I am.
Right.
Pick a word, you know, pick a verb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll come back to that. So I wanted to read very briefly. This will be the last quote I read.
That's great.
I think this actually comes out from Descartes. This is his discourse on method, and this comes from Discourse 6. As soon as I had acquired some general ideas about physics and beginning to test them on various particular difficulties, I observed how far they can lead and how they differ from the principles which have been used up to now. I believed I could not keep them hidden without sinning considerably against the law which obliges us to procure, by as much as in us, the general good of all men. For they have made me see that it is possible to arrive at knowledge which is most useful in life, and that instead of the speculative philosophy taught in the schools, a practical philosophy can be found by which, knowing the power and the effects of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies which surround us, as distinctly as we know the various trades of our craftsmen, we might put them in the same way to all the uses for which they are appropriate, and thereby make ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature.
Masters and possessors.
Right. And it is nature as a tool that only has instrumental value, right? This is giving permission for the exploitation of natural resources.
And actually not only permission, but encouragement and justification and logic for it. Yeah.
Right. And so what is nature? Right. So this idea of nature, it changes a lot. Here, nature starts to become, again, that duality contrasted with artificially created things. Nature is reduced to mere matter. It's a machine. And that is the idea that we go from organism to machine, right? It's the idea of a mechanistic clockwork universe. It's dead, it's passive, and is there to be controlled and dominated. Now, all of this leads us to the Industrial Revolution and sets us on this path. So the other thing I wanted to bring in here is this logic of dualism. And this is where I'm drawing upon the work of the late eco-feminist philosopher Val Plumwood. And she takes a look at Aristotelian categorical propositional logic, okay? Because she says this formalizes the logic of dualism, and she makes it clear she's not attacking the principles of classical logic per se. Logic is still important, right? But rather she's critiquing these features that correspond closely to the principles of classical logic that have been used to construct and justify a logic that supports domination of one group over the other. And I think that you have to add this into everything I've been saying. So she identified, one of the core principles of Aristotelian categorical logic is the principle of identity, the law of identity. Sometimes it's referred to as like A equals A. But it is also, and this is how she puts it, is that there is P and then there's not P. Right. And this is a foundational rule. There's a strict boundary between what is P and there's a boundary and what is not P. They're different categories. And that is what justifies this dualistic thinking, human, non-human, male, non-male, right? And that's any other category of gender, right? Not just women, but any other gender is in this not man.
And master, not master.
Right. And that's actually the language she's going to use. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. She's going to use this as an example, master slave morality here. And that's what she refers to it as. She says it creates a master narrative.
There you go.
And, it's, again, she's not rejecting logic, because sometimes this P, not P is important, like it's raining, it's not raining. Right. And what she wants to do is not abandon logic, but find a different non-hierarchical approach. One that makes a clear distinction between dualism and dichotomy, because she's going to say that dualism is value ridden. Okay. Whereas basic dichotomy isn't. Right? So she actually refers to this as the logic of colonization. And this is the foundation for much of Western culture and philosophy. She defines dualism as the process by which contrasting concepts, like masculine, feminine, gender identities, are formed by domination and subordination. They are constructed as oppositional and exclusive. So what she does is she identifies 5 key features of dualism. And I can go over these very quickly, but these 5 features are backgrounding, radical exclusion, incorporation, instrumentalism, and homogenization. Okay. So, and again, like I said, she uses the language of master and slave. So backgrounding is where the master class denies any dependency upon the slave class or the subaltern class, right? Despite the fact that the master class is only defined by their relationship to the other, right? A master can't be a master without the slave. But the master views the slave, the master views the other as inessential, that their contributions are irrelevant and even non-existent. And not only do members of the master class see themselves as superior, they view themselves as radically different from the other. And this is the second key feature of dualism, this radical exclusion. The master constructs strict boundaries that separates them from others who they deny help them in the first place. It is a form of what Plumwood calls hyper separation, where the master class tries to magnify, to emphasize and maximize the number of importance of differences, right? That there's all these differences, and eliminate, minimize any shared qualities. They're trying to maximize separation. That's that hyper separation. And we see this in these patriarchal separation of male and female, right? Male claims rationality, whereas the female is portrayed as emotional. The male is active, the female passive, the male dominant and competitive, whereas the female is inferior and submissive. This is what allows for hierarchies to be reasserted and confirmed. And by defining the other in relation to the master, all autonomy is removed from the other. The other is defined negatively in relationship to the master. That they lack all the essential qualities that only the master possesses. And I think an example here is I mentioned midwives, right? This is how it works out. Only the male doctors were viewed as having the knowledge and technology to properly birth a child, whereas the midwife's traditional knowledge was deemed both primitive, worthless, and dangerous.
Right.
Okay. Because the others lack autonomy, they are viewed as lacking in inherent value. They only have instrumental value. Because of that, the master doesn't empathize with the others, doesn't recognize them as part of the moral universe. They are only a means to achieving the master's ends. The only value of the other is how useful they are to the master. Here, and we saw this with Descartes, nature is viewed as having no value other than how it can be manipulated and used. And it's dehumanizing as well.
Literally.
Yes. Literally dehumanizing. And then finally, the class of others is homogenized. They're stereotyped. Their differences are ignored, which allows the master class to create this illusion of superiority by assigning universal characteristics to particular members.
Right. And it's easier to other them if they're all the same.
Yep. Yeah. And any inherent value of the other can be more easily ignored. Right. And so it's this stereotyping, this homogenization that supports instrumentalization, that supports the incorporation and radical exclusion. Right. So how do we get out of this mess? Okay, that's the big question, right? How do we get out of this mess?
Yes.
And I think that it's really important. I want to say that science is important. Science is valuable.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
But I think that we also need to recognize that science is not value free. That all too often science serves power, progress, and capital. And so what we need is a new paradigm. We need one that does not reduce everything to matter, one that is not reductive. And I think that we're seeing that. I think that it has been around for a little bit. And I think it's in ecology, right? Because ecology, my advisor, when I was working in my doctoral program, once asked in a class, is ecology the first of the new sciences or the last of the old? And, and I think that's a good question. Ecology has its roots in that organicism. It looks at everything as this integrated unity of structure and function.
Right.
Everything is connected and interrelated into a living unity. And it restores life to the world. The world's alive. So because of that, it's going to give us, again, more prohibitions on what we do to the natural world, how we relate to the natural world, because we can't look at it as just dead matter. And we can't just look at one tiny part of it. We have to look at the entirety of it.
Including ourselves.
Including ourselves, right?
Yep.
We also need to recognize and value, and this is what you were saying a little bit ago, different ways of knowing. The eco-feminist philosopher Karen Warren talks about this, and she says that instead of human rationality, she said that what we should do is think in terms of intelligences. Where rational intelligence is important, but it's not the only game in town. So rational intelligence, yes, but also emotional intelligence. What's been referred to as traditional ecological knowledge. This is knowledge that comes out of indigenous cultures, and how they relate to the world. And so by focusing on intelligence rather than human rationality, it allows the inclusion also of non-human others. You know, animals, trees, ecosystems, rivers, mountains that have systematically been excluded from the Western moral universe as non-rational agents. And I think this is where I want to bring in the spirituality, right? Because the spirituality associated with patriarchy is all about order, and it's all about the implementation of religion, rules coming down from God, right? And we see that. That's how the scientific method started working. Going back to Bacon and Descartes, it was that understanding nature was understanding God's laws, right? But what the eco-feminist philosophers argue for is a life-affirming spirituality that's grounded in the material world. None of this escaping the material world, as, you know, because that's life denying, you know, and that's what so many of the traditions focus on is, you know, what comes after. Rather, we need a spirituality that's here and now. And I think that I always think in terms of the word religion, you know, the etymology of it, you know, it's Latin, it comes from religere, which means to rebind or reconnect. And so the question is always, well, rebind or reconnect to what? And traditionally it's, well, God or spirit. But I want to make the case that what we need to reconnect with is the earth, because it's the beauty of the earth that gives us our most awe-inspiring moments, you know, and religion without awe is meaningless, you know? And so this earth-based spirituality is the understanding that everything is interconnected. And when that's realized, we'll know that we are part of a living community, the earth, in which we can be empowered, in which we can be connected to the earth, and we can take action together to heal the earth. And community is important. Community is vital. I think that spiritual community is an antidote to separation and individualism. So, you know, we need to discard the idea of the moral agent as primarily one adopting a position of a disinterested rationality, you know, and that also has connections to science, you know, because science was always done as this like view from nowhere.
And
right?
Anthropology and all kinds of things, right?
Yeah. So, you know, we have to abandon these ideas of abstract ethical rules from an objective point of view. Instead, we need an ethic that highlights diversity of experiences from people of many different cultures, many different socioeconomic realities, and different genders, because everyone's experiencing the world according to their own particular circumstances, specific to their time and place. So this is what I'm calling for, is a ethic, an inclusive ethic that's based on diversity, relationship, and love. And I think that also, to tie it back to the witch here for a moment, the modern concept of witchcraft is helpful. You know, I don't identify as a witch, but we understand witchcraft now as a pagan nature religion. It's a wild green spirituality that's connected to feminism. It's also connected to self-realization and liberation. You know, the figure of the witch then becomes an embodiment of independent female power. And I would say not just female power, but power for the queer and disenfranchised.
Right.
So in conclusion, you know, I began by citing Noam Chomsky, who suggested that the governments of the world might have been infected with a lethal kind of insanity. And it does not seem that he was very off the mark in that comment. But he didn't really offer much in terms of a diagnosis, right? He didn't really have much to say about what led us to the brink of mass ecocide and the largest extinction event that we've had since the days of the dinosaurs, right? he doesn't say how the Western world might have been contaminated by such irrationality. I think that it is when we look at the philosophical, scientific, and religious assumptions that have guided modern progress and examine them through the lens of gender that the problem can be made clear. And that's why I like eco-feminist philosophy so much, is because I think that it critiques patriarchy and the logic of dualism. The logic of dualism, of course, is what allows for the oppression of nature, women, people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, and non-human others. By revealing the hierarchical framework and what justifies it, the logic, the reasoning that justifies it. Ecofeminist philosophy, I think, allows us finally to think about correcting patriarchal's anti-environmental madness by challenging dualistic thinking, bringing to the foreground what has been backgrounded, recognizing the inherent value of those who have been historically subjugated and deemed inferior, by celebrating diversity, by celebrating pluralistic perspectives of women, indigenous cultures, people of color, and all the other minority groups. That's how we can begin to dismantle a system that benefits the few at the expense of many. By creating non-hierarchical communities where all genders, the human and the non-human, are equally valued. That's how we can begin the healing process. And I think that through understanding the infinite connections of humans with each other and the natural world, ecofeminist philosophy also provides a spiritual ground from which we can be empowered to act in ways that are beneficial to life and social justice. By reconnecting with nature, we can fulfill the, I think, inherent religious impulse that we all feel. All right. And it's an impulse to celebrate life. You mentioned this earlier, it's to celebrate life, to sing, to dance, to rejoice in just the thrill of existence, to tell stories, create rituals in praise of existence, and this is an existence that's way more complicated, way more intricate, and way more enduring than we are, right? And the stories that we will tell, the narratives we create, can be a very powerful part of this new ethic, one based on relationship and diversity rather than exclusion and abstract ideas. And this, I think, is the best vaccine that we have for this lethal insanity. I think this is the path to healing ourselves, our communities, and Earth, which is our only home.
Phenomenal. Brilliant. You need to write that into a book. The whole thing. Your book is written right there. Just transcribe this talk.
Yeah, well, I'm actually thinking of putting this into making it a paper.
Yes.
And submitting it. So I know that someone's looking for submissions for something very closely aligned with this.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if we had many more hours, I would say, I would love to hear more on your thoughts around the scientific method, and is there a differing paradigm that we could possibly switch into? It also makes me think about, like I mentioned, anthropology and kind of the incorrect thinking that you could observe, quote unquote, another culture and not be affecting it as you're observing it. It's just incorrect. Wrong.
Right.
That whole thing. But it goes, anyway. And then my big takeaway from all of this, on a very, very, very brief level is, wow, just the theme of this, the title of the symposium is Rebecoming the One, of course. And so you're highlighting for me that everything that I care about with all of this is really steeped in this dualistic way of thinking. And again, not that we want to do away entirely with dichotomy or difference, but yeah, the point really is about coming back to the wholeness that we are. And
yeah, we need to move beyond the value judgments that are within the dualisms,
yeah.
because I think it's those value judgments that create so much suffering, you know. You know, I've not seen any kind of thinking of breaking down those value judgments that is as strong and as vital as what I found in like the works of Val Plumwood and Carolyn Merchant. I think it's just amazing. But there's a lot that needs to be unpacked. And you're right. There's so much to this. There's so much in so many different ways, you know, and I struggled a little bit trying to think, okay, how am I going to keep this concise and connect the things, because you know, it can just explode.
Oh yeah. Well, and I'll just say, like, if I were to say, okay, here's a practical day-to-day way, a takeaway that maybe I could take away or anybody could take away from listening to this. One thing that I've been working on in myself, which is very related to all of this, is really noticing where I carry a sense of the othering in any way whatsoever. So like I mentioned this at some in one of the other talks in the symposium somewhere, and I can't remember which one, but I was born in Thailand and grew up in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Kenya, and then Northern Virginia in the United States. And I'm white, very white. And when I was a child living in these other countries, I was absolutely part of the colonialist class, like hands down, no doubt, like to an extreme, right? It's just so stark there. So I grew up like that. And I am absolutely radically against colonialist thinking, and yet it is ingrained in me. So I notice that's part of what I've just been doing over the past few years, just noticing, oh, there's this feeling or this thought that just came up in me where I'm othering someone other than me. Interesting. I don't like that feeling. Okay, what can I do to shift that? You know, and then the same with how I choose to eat. I don't want to participate in eating food that has been, you know, like as an animal stuck in a cage, literally sitting in its own crap all day long, where we're treating this living being as not alive. That doesn't work for me. You know, so many things, so many examples, but really about like bringing back to my own wholeness, the wholeness of myself with literally everything else. And it's a process. It is a major process. You know, I don't know how it'll take, probably what, through this whole lifetime and beyond. I don't know.
Well, it's, you know, what you're describing in many ways, it's shadow work.
Yes.
You know,
there we go.
You know, I spoke to Connie Zweig, who is sort of like the shadow work expert, right? And in our conversation, she even mentioned that, yeah, it's a lifetime endeavor. It's something that you always have to work at. And she's like, and who knows, maybe it is going to be other lifetimes. You know, but it's difficult. You know, it's difficult to do that because we do it so automatically. It's so unconscious. You know, and that's the whole point of the shadow, is it is unconscious.
Right.
And I'll just share with you how I've approached it is, you know, my ethical background is in virtue ethics, and virtue ethics is actually very consistent with feminist ethics and ecofeminism. And for me, you know, I like virtue because it's about being the best person you can be, you know, not following rules imposed down upon you, but being the best person you can. And I noticed that during the Trump presidency, you know, I loathed Donald Trump, and I know I wasn't alone in that. But I always made a point of never saying I hated him. And too many people did. And I would never say that I hated his supporters either. And what I tried to do in my thinking with him and those who supported him was like, okay, what is it that I don't like about them? And then I turn it around onto myself. So for example, you know, I didn't like Trump's arrogance. Right. I didn't like his ignorance. I I didn't like him being a bully. So I then said, okay, in what ways am I arrogant? In what ways am I ignorant? In what ways am I a bully? You know, what things do I believe without evidence? You know, and it's that turning around. So I considered that a kind of shadow work as
Absolutely.
well.
And of course, I mean, this goes without saying, but he is him, yet he is a reflection of, guess who elected him? Us.
Yeah,
Well, us
exactly.
in the United States, right? Not
Yeah.
me. I mean, I didn't vote for him, but we all did get him into power in some way or another. And therefore he is a reflection of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It's
could
good.
not agree more.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So I wish we could keep talking and talking, but just before we officially end, I would love for you to share what you do in the world. I said a little bit in your bio, but what would you like people to reach out to you regarding? Or I know you have your podcast.
Right.
Please name anything you want people to know.
Well, yes, the podcast is Rebel Spirit Radio, and it is on most of the major podcast platforms. There's also a YouTube channel for it, which can be found very easily at youtube.com/Rebel Spirit Radio. There's a web page, rebelspiritradio.com, and there is actually a place there where people can sign up for a newsletter mailing list, which I would love if people would do that. I am working on, it's not complete yet, but I am working on also creating a personal website, which I've had, but right now it's a bunch of templates. And when that goes active, that will be nsmather.com. And I am working on hopefully offering some courses and some possibly workshops and retreats in the future.
Wonderful.
And so everything will be found on the nsmather.com. But if people go there now, it's going to be a lot of nonsense.
Well, maybe when it's ready, let me know, and I'll send out an email to everyone here, even beyond the symposium. Because I'm happy to. I would love to keep people updated on what you're doing.
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, and I'm working on turning this into a article. And I have been toying with the idea of a book on the archetype of awakening.
Whoa.
Yeah.
We should talk again when you do that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I'm always happy to talk.
Wow. That is awesome. Yeah, because that's a whole other side that's very related to the work that I do. So
yeah. I'm all over the place in terms of my educational background and my interests. So but yeah, the archetype of awakening, I've been thinking, we hear this all the time. People are like, you need to wake up. And I'm like, well, what does that mean?
Right. Absolutely. And where does that come from? And where did we get that word even? And yeah.
I think it's part of our evolution, actually.
Cool. Seriously, we should have another conversation.
Yes, of course.
We're ready for that. Yeah.
Cool. I'd be more than happy to.
Yay. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for being here, for adding to this. This was many layers of amazing, and yeah, more to come, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. It's meant a lot for me to participate in this, and I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. You too.